Welcome to the Connect with BMC Helix ITSM webinar. Today's webinar is an on-demand webinar that will be available from July 20th to the 27th. During this time, you'll be able to participate by listening to this webinar, and you can also rewatch it at any time during this period it is open. After this period, it will be moved to our YouTube channel and available there. Today's topic is getting started with archiving, and Doug Reif is our presenter today, and I'll turn it over to him to take us through this content.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks everyone for joining today's Connect with BMC Helix ITSM webinar. My name is Doug Reif. I'm a Principal Technical Support Analyst with BMC, and today's topic is getting started with archiving. The agenda for today will be to show you some scenarios to help you understand when and why you might use archiving. And then we'll provide some solutions using archiving to show you how you can make use of them in those scenarios. Next, we'll talk about enabling and configuring archiving to fit your specific needs. Then we'll look at some troubleshooting, and then we'll provide some references at the end so you can do more research on your own after the webinar. Now let's start by looking at some scenarios in which archiving might come into play a role. First, you may have data in your ITSM environments that's continually growing. This is pretty common. This happens in virtually every environment that's live. You have transactional data such as your incident forms, your chains, your asset forms, any forms that your end users are adding to or updating on a daily basis. They're going to just continually grow over time as you add data. It kind of goes without saying. You also have historical data. Maybe you're collecting server statistics, and depending on how you have server statistics set up, it may be collecting a lot of data and just growing over time. You have information in your work logs, you have knowledge, and this information just grows and grows over time. You also have temporary data such as email messages, UDM logs, NTE notifier, CAI events, just to name some examples. Now, some of this temporary data can be handled in other ways, like, for example, CAI events has an escalation that can come through and prune some of the data out of it. Email messages can be set up so that you delete notifications as soon as they get sent out. So in some of the cases, there are other ways to either help or to completely get rid of the extra data. But in other cases, you still may want to look at temporary data as something that you need to manage. So all this data that's growing over time can cause database bloat. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And to use the word bloat may not be the right word, but the database is going to grow and continually grow unless you do something to manage that space. The database contains large quantities of data that may be unneeded. So some of the incidents that are very old may not need to be saved. They may not need to be accessible. Some of the server statistics from, say, 2-3 years ago may no longer be relevant. Old email messages that have been sent 5 years ago may not be relevant. So it's taking up space and perhaps large quantities of space that may not be needed. Also, a lot of forms have the ability to store attachments, and attachments in the database consumes quite a lot of space. So this is a scenario that is probably a typical scenario for any live environment, but something for you to think about is in this typical scenario, you still need to think about what can I do to manage my space. The next scenario I want to look at is when the large amount of data that you have in your ITSM environment is actually causing performance issues. Performance can degrade while having to traverse all the data that you've collected over time. If you did a query on a form that had 3 months of data and you did the same query on a form that had 7 years of data, you're going to find that performance will degrade when you have huge amounts of data. Query results thresholds could cause undesirable search results. For example, if you said, I only want to look at the top 500 results, what you might find is if you had 7 years of data that you're looking through, the top 200 or 500 records may not contain the record that you're looking for. It's possible that SQL indexes might become less effective. There's an optimizer in the database that decides whether or how to use an index. And the more data that you have, it sometimes occurs that the optimizer just says, look, there's too much data for me to load, or there's too many pages of index data for me to look at. So instead of using an index, I'm just going to load the data from the table. That happens sometimes, and it happens often because there's huge amounts of data. Another thing in the database is that caching might be less effective because you may end up utilizing the memory for the cache from loading lots and lots of data that you don't even need. So it's possible that you're negatively affecting the performance of your database simply because you're holding on to too much data. The third scenario I want to talk about is when the data in your ITSM environment becomes outdated, that is, that no longer meets your retention policies. Some of your data may need to be offline, and some of it may need to be destroyed or deleted just to meet your retention policies. For example, BMC recommends a policy of 2 years of production data, 5 years of archive data, and after that, the data is deleted. So the data has a lifespan of 7 years. You need to consult your company's retention policy, but do think about this as you consider what data that you want to keep live and what data you want to archive. The solutions to all three of these scenarios may be to archive your data. When you archive your data, you move the older data out of the live ITSM system and into archive forms. This reduces the size of the live data tables. Data is available for retention purposes after you've archived it, so you can locate specific data in the archive forms, and you can create reports that are required by your retention policies or for whatever reason that you need to access that data. And it's important to note that no workflow fires on these archive forms, so they're really not considered a part of the ITSM system anymore. Lastly, once the criteria is met, you can delete the data that's no longer needed to be stored. And by the way, BMC provides you an easy-to-use archive manager to help you enable and configure archiving. The second part of this solution is to archive the associated data. When a parent record is archived, the children can be archived as well. This prevents child data from residing in ITSM forms with no meaningful purpose. Child data contains information that must be kept as part of the retention policy. You can have a one-to-one or a one-to-many relationship between the parent and the child records. For example, a single incident might have hundreds of work log entries. Relationships from parent to children forms come out of the box with the ITSM archive solution. Now, this is an example from Developer Studio showing the associations that come out of the box. I'm looking at associations for just the primary form, HPD Help Desk, and you can see there's 19 associations shown here. I have highlighted the one for the work log form, and you can see when I've opened that up that there's a one-to-many relationship, meaning that for any one incident, there might be multiple work logs. And to find those children records, we use the qualification where incident number on the primary form is equal to the incident number on the secondary form. So that's a brief example of how associations are set up. It sounds like archiving might be the right solution for all these scenarios we talked about. So how would you go about enabling archiving? Well, the good news is ITSM comes pre-configured with archiving. Archiving is configured for all the main forms that come with ITSM, and in fact, it's already even enabled for several of the CMDB policies. Policies are created in the archive management console that I showed you earlier, and these have been predefined for a certain age in days that you can use as a default. And the aging date is based on the submit date. For example, if you wanted to archive, say, help desk tickets that were 2 years old, the archive policy would look at the submit date for those help desk tickets and archive the ones based on the submit date. Also, associations are predefined as well. Just as I showed you with the help desk form earlier, all the relevant relationships are already set up so that the child records are archived. Here's an example of just some of the archive policies that come with the product. For example, HPD Help Desk is set up to archive only tickets where the status was greater than or equal to closed and where a field on the form called Do Not Archive has not been set. So this gives you an option. Even if the date criterion is met, you can still identify a record to never be archived, so it always remains in the live data. And lastly, the aging date is based on the submit date. And you can see something similar for the other forms. For example, the problem investigation is based on the investigation status being greater than or equal to rejected, and again, the Do Not Archive field hasn't been set. So if you look further down, you'll notice that in the Knowledge Article Manager is slightly different because the aging date is based on the article last modified date. And this is important because that's a key field that we use to identify whether a knowledge article is current or out of date. And you can look at the rest of these to get an example how the policies work. In a default properly installed environment, archiving should already be ready to go and in fact already running. But some of the things you might want to check are that the ranking form is set up correctly. So out of the box, an archive operation is already set up, but what you want to do is make sure that the right server has been ranked for archive. If you have a production environment, you may have multiple backend servers, and one of those servers will probably be the one that's running archive. Also, archive threads can be adjusted. By default, you get a single archive thread, but depending on your need, you might want to enable multiple archive threads. Only one thread runs per policy, but if you have multiple threads, you can have multiple policies running at the same time. For an example, let's say that you have a large number of help desk records that need to be archived. Well, one thread could be running through the help desk records, and another thread could be starting what other policies become active at the same time. And the last thing is to make sure that the server group archive is enabled. There's a parameter called disable archive global, and we just want to make sure that is set to false, so it doesn't disable this feature. Now let's look at the Archive Manager console. The first thing you want to look at is that little checkbox on the left that says Enable Server Group Archive. And this is a setting I was just talking about. If you uncheck this, this actually sets the Disable Archive Global to true, which effectively turns off archiving. So we want to make sure that that is checked and enabled. The next thing is the run every hours, and you can see it's set up to run every 24 hours. What this means is once AR server has been started, at that point, every 24 hours, archiving will kick off and look to see if there's any active policies to run. Now, up until now, all the settings that we've talked about worked out of the box as is. You really didn't need to change anything in order for archiving to work. So this is the point that you really need to pay attention, because this is where you're going to need to perform some actions in order to get archiving to work properly. So we're looking at the custom specified age in days. If you look at the very bottom left of your screen, you'll see a little asterisk that says disabling a policy will set the custom age to -1. And you'll notice that in the custom specified age in days column, there's a bunch of -1s. That means that all those policies are disabled. Well, you can quickly look and see some that don't have a -1, and those are the policies that actually are enabled out of the box. If you were to look at your system right now, you would see that if you hadn't done anything, these policies are running, archive is running. You can simply turn on archive logging if you'd like and go and see that these policies for mostly CMDB are taking place and they're actually archiving data. But most of the rest of these are policies that you're going to want to take some kind of action on. If you look at the first one, AR System Email Error Logs Archive. This policy is going to work on the email engine. And you notice that the default policy age in days is 548. That's a year and a half. So that's the default setting for a lot of these, is a year and a half, but that might not be what your policy is. That might not meet your retention policy. So what you should do is come in here and specify the custom specified age in days, change it from -1 to whatever you need, which might be 2 years, it might be 5 years. And so what you'll want to do is go through each of these rows that have a -1 and change it to the appropriate number of days that meet your retention policy. Now, if it turns out that the age that you want to keep happens to be the same value that's in the default policy age in days, then you simply can blank out the -1 and just leave it as a null value. Now, in order to do that, in order to make that change, what you need to do is go down to the age in days field on the bottom, make sure that you have the correct row highlighted, type in the value for the new age in days, and then simply click apply, and it will add the new value to the custom specified age in days column. That's all you need to do. So let's quickly look at, other than the settings, what other configurations should you have to make on your environment in order to have archiving work at its best. Well, let me just tell you, there's a really good knowledge article. It's 262.813, and it's a knowledge article on archiving considerations for best practices. And just in a nutshell, some of the things that it has you look at are the archive ranking to make sure that you have the correct server ranked, and if you need failover, that you have maybe a secondary and tertiary server ranked as well. It has you look at the archiving threads and make sure that you have the optimal number of threads. In some cases, maybe 1 is fine. In other cases, 2, 3, or more threads might be needed. Also, there's the archiving interval that I showed you was set to 24 hours. That's something that you may need to change for your environment. And the last thing is the AR server heap size. That has an effect on how well archiving runs, especially if you have lots and lots of records to archive that all have lots and lots of children records to archive. It may take more heap size in order to do all that work. And then the second thing the knowledge article looks at is the archive policy considerations, like the archive policy age and days, the association objects, and the archive qualifications. Those are things that you have some control over, and at a minimum, you should be aware of what those are. So this knowledge article will help you go through all those settings and configurations and make sure that your system is set up properly. Let's look at the life cycle of an archive record. So first of all, you have the policy and associations that are already set up, but you can do some configuration. And let's look specifically at the example of maybe a HPD help desk record. So the ITSM policy has already been set up. The default qualification is there. The default age and days is set up, which you can modify if you'd like. And also the status. If it's a -1, it'll be disabled. And if you've changed it, then it'll be enabled. And so the HPD help desk record and all the children records are already to be set up as long as they meet the qualifications. So if the archive engine is running, which again, it should be by default, then it will pick up the policy for HPD help desk on the default 24-hour interval. And for any record that now meets the qualification, it will move the data into an archive form. So it'll go through the help desk record and all the children records, and it'll offload the data out of the live tables and move them into the offline archive forms, which are no longer a part of the ITSM system. And then lastly, the third part of the retention policy is to remove the real old data. So in our example, we said we wanted to archive data that was over 2 years old, and then any data that was over 7 years old, we would remove it. So as the last step, you can export the data if you'd like. You can export them as a CSV record. You can create a report if you'd like. But however you'd like to keep your data, if you need to, go ahead and do that. And the last step is actually to delete the data out of the archive forms that meet your criteria. You may be wondering about that last step when you need to delete from the archive form if the time criteria is met. Well, first of all, you may want to report to a file, somehow export the data so you can keep it, and you have some options. Smart reporting, create an AR server report, or you can use an option that we provided on the archive console. So if you look at the picture here, at the very bottom of the archive manager console, there's a menu for operation. And that menu has 3 different items: export and delete, export, or just delete. And depending on your environment, you may be able to use this option to export and delete your data all in one step. And what you do is you put in the age and days field, you put in the number of days for the criteria to delete your data. So this might be the 7 years or 2,555 days if you like. And if you chose that and you say export and delete, then when you click on the apply button, you will get CSV files for every policy for all the records that match the date criterion, and then this functionality will go in and delete all the data that meets that criterion. Now, some environments, especially container environments, you may not be able to do the export. The files go into your AR system DB directory, and that might not be convenient for you or even possible for you. So in those cases, you'll want to find another method of exporting the data, assuming you need to keep it, and then just come down here and choose the delete option. And so once you choose a delete option, choose your days, and then click on the export button, then it will go in and delete your data, and that will be the final act for your archive data. Now let me go over some of this information live with a demo. Okay, I've just logged into my system as an administrator, and I'm on the home page. So now I'm going to click on the flyout menu, go to AR System Administrator, and the very first item on the list is the AR System Archive Manager console. So this is the console I've showed you a couple times before. And you'll notice right away that Enable Server Group Archive is checked. So it is enabled like it is by default. And just as we saw, that it's running every 24 hours. And you'll notice all the policies, the default policy age, and the custom age and days, and all the negative ones, which mean that they are disabled. And then on the bottom, you'll notice the operation menu where I can export and delete, or just delete if I need to. And then here I'll put in the number of days. So let's start by going down the checklist of things that we need to do to make sure archive is going to work. Well, the first thing obviously is the checkbox on the top left. This, as I mentioned, sets a setting in the AR system. So let's go and look at the centralized configuration. So go back to my main screen. We'll go to Administration, we'll go to the Air System Administration console, and then down to the centralized configuration. Now we'll go into the shared section because that's where these settings are stored. And the first thing we'll notice is that Disable Archive Global is set to false. So it is not disabled, which is what we expect. The other thing you'll notice in here is num archive threads. Now this isn't here by default. I've come in here and I've set this parameter in the shared section to 2. So on my system, I have 2 archive threads. So that's what you expect to see in your settings. We'll go ahead and close that. Go back to the Archive Manager. Now another thing that you want to do is check the ranking. Let's make sure that archive is ranked. And you can do that easily from the home page. We'll go down to the Remedy Management Console, go to the Server Group Console, we'll go to Ranking, and we just want to make sure that archive is ranked. And in my environment, the server that I'm on happens to be the server that's ranked number 1, so that's fine. Go ahead and close that. Go back to the Archive Manager. And now the next thing we want to do is look at the policies that have a -1, and if we want to enable them, then we'll want to provide a value or use the default value of 1.5 years. Now, if you look at the policy description, this may not be enough information for you to make that decision. Well, let's look at one of them here. Change Management Archive Policy. What does that mean? I don't really know what that's archiving. Well, one thing you can do is open up a form called AR System Archive Policy. Do a query in this form so we can see the data. And you'll see all the different policies that are in here. And here's a policy called CHG Infrastructure Change that looks like the one that I just was referring to. And if I click on it, you'll see the description is what shows up in the Archive Manager console. Change Management Archive Policy, that's the one I was just looking at. And now from this form, I can tell that it's going to archive entries from the form called CHG Infrastructure Change, and it's going to archive into a form called CHG Infrastructure Change Archive. And I can see here the information that I already saw, which was the default age is 548, and it's currently set to -1, so it's disabled. So this helps you get just a little bit more information about what the policy is before you try to enable it. Well, now knowing that this is the CHG Infrastructure Change form, I now may be able to make a better decision about the retention policy and what I need to change this to. So when I highlight this record, I can go down to this enable policy and then specify the age and days. And let's say I wanted to have it for just 1 year, just as an example. That's not my retention policy, but for an example, if I want to change it to that, I can click apply. And you'll see it now put in the custom specified age and days what I had typed. Now, quite often what you might want to do is just null it out so that it uses the default. So you can simply put in a 0 for the age and days, and it will blank that out and it will use the default. So that's valid as well. Now, one more thing that you can do from this management console is you can find a policy and execute it right now. If you don't execute it right now, then it may take up to 24 hours, depending on when AR server started, for that policy to run. And then when it does run, it's going to go through all the enable policies and run those as well. So if you'd like to just out of the normal cycle, just start a policy and get it going, you can simply highlight the policy that you want to use and click on Run Selected Policy Now. So that's how you enable archiving. That's most of the settings that you'll need to look at. And now, once you've gone through all your policies and you've set the right policy age, then archive is working. It's moving your data every 24 hours. It's looking at the policy, looking for records that meet the qualification, and moving that data into the archive forms. Now, that's the second part of the life cycle of the archive record. And then periodically, you should come in here and look at this operation and decide, do I want to export and delete or just delete, and based on how many days. Now, this might be a normal part of your maintenance, is maybe once a month you come in here and you specify whatever the age and days is that you want to delete your data, and then come in and delete it. And if you need to, make sure that you've exported it first. So that concludes the demo, and now we'll look at troubleshooting. BMC Support has created several troubleshooting guides. In fact, we've been on a mission for the last couple of years to really build up our troubleshooting guides in the documentation. And you can find these by going to the documentation and then looking on the left-hand pane for troubleshooting. And under that troubleshooting section, for whatever document you're in, you should find several troubleshooting guides to help you walk through certain kinds of troubleshooting activities depending on the product. These troubleshooting guides are based on issues that support receives from customers, and we also build these guides in a way that helps you either solve the issue or help provide support with enough information where it makes it easier for us to solve the issue faster for you. So if you click on the Troubleshooting the Archive Process link there, you'll get some troubleshooting guides specifically for archiving. And now I want to actually walk you through some of these troubleshooting steps. So let's look at a scenario where records are not being moved to the archive. So maybe you've enabled archiving, you're expecting it to work, and you're just not seeing records show up in the archive form. So some of the possible causes are the do not archive flag was set on the record. And that's kind of an obvious thing, but it's something you need to check. Maybe there's quite a few records that people had been enabling the do not archive flag on, and those are not going to get archived. The other thing is the submit date may not be meeting your age criterion. And sometimes you might forget what field it's checking on. And so later on, say 3, 4, 5 months from now, you might forget that it's actually the submit date that we care about. It's not the close date. It's not the last modified date. It's the submit date. So it's important to remember that. And when you're looking to see if records are being archived, just keep that in mind that only records where the submit date met the criterion are going to be archived. And so the solution for this would just be to ensure that the record does meet all the criterion that was set up for that. Let's look at another common troubleshooting scenario. Let's say archiving is running very slow. What can you do? Well, it's possible that the cause for this is that the form that's being archived has a large amount of data in it. And along with the form itself, it's possible that some or all of the associated forms also have a huge amount of data. Let's give an example. Let's say you started archiving help desk for the first time and you have years and years of data. Archiving picks it up and it starts to look at all the records that meet that submit date criterion, and it's going to start archiving those. These are going to be running on a single thread, and it's going to be working through each individual record one at a time, but it's also going to have to process all the records for all of the associated forms. And that could take quite a while to run. I mean, conceivably, it could take days or weeks or even longer, just depending on how much data it has to archive, remembering that that's happening on a single thread. So what are the solutions? Well, one solution might be to consider looking at the num archive thread setting. You might want to add 2 or 3 threads, but you need to remember that that's going to allow policies to run concurrently, but it's not going to do anything about a single policy. So in the example I gave with HPD Help Desk, that entire policy, the form and all the associated forms are still all going to run on an individual thread, but what's going to happen by enabling the num archive threads is that other policies will be able to pop in, get run simultaneously, and perhaps if you had 2 or 3 threads, you can have 2 or 3 policies running concurrently. Waiting until there's a huge amount of data to archive usually results in a long initial archive run. So the first time that the archiving runs could be a very long time. And that's one thing that I want to tell you today is don't wait until you have huge amounts of data. This is something that can be just started right away. And if you start it right away, even if you don't have a huge amount of data to archive, at least if you start it, it can keep up rather than trying to play catch up with a huge amount of data later. You can consider enabling archiving before the data has grown very large for just that reason. This is a maintenance thing, and even if there was very few records to maintain, at least you get the process started, so as time goes by, it's something that's easy to keep up with. Let's look at one more troubleshooting scenario. In this scenario, archiving of certain policies never seems to run. Now, this symptom might seem very similar to the first scenario where you're seeing data is not being moved from the main form to the archive form. In this case, it's slightly different, is we're seeing that it appears that the policy is never running at all. And one way that might be evidenced is by looking at the archive form, and you see there's no data in there, which again is very similar to the first problem we looked at. A difference here might be is it's possible you did a little bit more investigation. Maybe you already turned on the archive logging and you can see that this particular policy is never running. And so that's one of the steps that we're going to do while troubleshooting this, is to turn on the archive logging. But let's just say, at this point, we're not really sure. We haven't turned logging on. All we know is that there is no data being moved from the main form to the archive form, and so that might be this scenario. There's several possible causes for this. One might be that an error occurred while trying to archive the data. We don't know where the error is right now. It could be that while trying to save it to the archive form, it got an error, something like maybe out of extents in the database. Could be that while trying to read the record, we got some sort of error message. It could be that there's a filter that fires on AIR server. So one example would be is you're archiving a record, you move the record to the archive form, and then you want to delete it. And for some reason, you can't delete it because there's a filter preventing that delete action from occurring. So archiving is not going to complete correctly when it encounters errors. Even if part of it could have run, perhaps it got far enough along to push it to the archive form and it just couldn't delete it. If it encounters an error, that particular record probably isn't going to get saved in the archive form, and that entire policy might just exit. So it's important to start looking at error messages. Also ensure that you don't have workflow that is going to prevent this. For example, when I mentioned you might have workflow that fires on delete, well, make sure that you don't have any custom workflow that fires on delete that's going to impact this. The next thing you want to do is make sure you have enabled logs. So enable the archive logging and also enable SQL API and filter log, because those will tell you any of those other scenarios, such as a database error, a filter error, or something else. So also you're probably going to want to look at the AIR error log and the AIR debug log, the standard logs that you would look at when you're troubleshooting a problem, because it's possible that AIR server itself is encountering a problem. So you want to look for any relevant error messages in any of those logs. And once you find it, the error message should help you focus on the problem and try to resolve that. So that's it for the troubleshooting issues. Let's now look at the references. I provided just 3 references here. These are all pretty good references. First of all is the archive best practices that I referred to in the presentation today. Here's the link for it, and this has a lot of good background information on archiving and then some recommendations on how to configure it. I included the link to the troubleshooting guide. This is the parent link, and then from there's several archive types of troubleshooting guides. And lastly, the documentation for archiving really is very thorough. It's been around a while and it's been growing and getting better, and there's just a lot of really good archiving documentation on setting it up, understanding it, setting up associations, customizing. It's all in there, so please refer to the documentation. So that's it for the presentation today. In summary, we looked at when and why to use archiving, how to archive. We looked at the life cycle of archived data. We looked at how to configure archiving, and we looked at troubleshooting. So thank you very much for your time today, and I hope that this presentation was useful to you. Back to you, Greg.
Thank you. And now I'll take us through the self-help in contacting BMC. The YouTube channel where this webinar will be posted is listed here. It contains past webinars as well as a rich set of how-to videos. The Connect with BMC Helix ITSM and Remedy webinar schedule is available at this community's link, and the Hot Off the Press newsletter for trending information is available at this community's post. As always, contacting technical support via web, phone, email, and these social channels is available. At this time, that will conclude this webinar. Thank you for attending.